All right. So I think it was last week. Last week, I was on my way into because I work a 9 to 5, right? So I was on my way into the office, and I usually have to take a highway to get there. I'm getting off the highway on I guess off ramp. I'm on the off ramp, and I come to this traffic light. I mean, basically, you can either go left or right, so you can only go one way. So, you turn whatever. So I'm turning left, and I get to the stoplight. Light is red, so I stop. There's a car in front of me though, and they stop. Right? Everything is simple. Everything is normal. We got our turn signals on. We both had to go left, so we both have our turn signals on to go left. And we're sitting there, and I'm doing my normal thing when I'm at a stoplight, which is pretty much fidget because I get incredibly awkward for some reason. I feel like everybody's watching me when I'm just sitting there in my car, just like. So I gotta find something to do because it's just weird, right? I'm like just sitting there. But anyway, we're sitting there, but I notice I look out my rear view mirror and I see back behind me, cars are starting to pile up a little bit. I'm like, wait a minute, how long have we been at this light? Right? And we've been there for maybe like 5 minutes. I was like, oh, so this is a really, really long light. And I'm like, wait, more cars started piling up behind me. And I'm just like, no, okay, something doesn't make sense here. So what I end up doing is I'm like, okay, this light isn't going to change. So that's the determination I made. The light isn't going to change. So I pull out, I kind of cut around the person that's in front of me because they weren't moving. And I cut around in front of the person that was in front of me, and the light still wasn't changing. And so then I made the left turn into traffic where everybody's going, and I'm driving away. Did it safely, right? And I'm going about my business. I'm driving away. And as I'm driving away, I'm hit with this notion, this idea, just these thoughts on rules, right? Because I'm driving away and they're getting smaller and smaller in my rearview mirror, and I'm like, okay, and no one moved. Still, no one was moving. So like two, they were like micro dots, and I'm just like, still everybody was sitting there, and still the light hadn't changed, obviously, because I'm like, well, why aren't y'all going anywhere? And it really just brought up this, again, like I said, this idea on rules, right? So technically, I broke, the rule, right? At a stoplight, you're supposed to stop. When it's red, you stop. When it's green, then you go, right? And you assume a certain timing and all that fun stuff. But either way, you see it's red, you got to bring your car to a stop. And when you see it's green, then you go ahead and go, right? So technically, I broke that rule. But then my mind goes, and it was almost immediate, right? Like right away, where as I was driving away, my mind goes to the nature of a rule or a law, right? And it's interesting. So the first thing that comes through to me, immediately is, well, the rule only applies based on a assumed set of conditions. So in order for this rule to be a rule, there has to also be some condition or conditions that are assumed, right? Beyond that, when it comes to a certain rule or a certain set of rules, whatever maybe, or laws, you also have to understand that even the intent is assumed as well. So in this case of a traffic light, right, the rule, the set of conditions basically is, well, we need structure for all of these vehicles driving on the road, right? So the set of conditions is the traffic light was working properly. That was assumed, right? But I had enough evidence to say that maybe it wasn't working properly. Therefore, the rule is a little different. But see, that's also where you get this whole idea there's exceptions to every rule, right? And I was thinking about this even more, like, because I'm by that time, I'm already in the parking lot of my job, and I'm just sitting there thinking about this whole thing. I'm just like, wait a minute. And Random. That's why it's in the random section. But I was sitting there really, really thinking about, again, the nature of a rule. It's like a bunch of like if statements, like if this, then that, basically, when it comes to the assumptions made behind a rule, the nature of the rule, right? And again, in this case, I'm at a traffic stop. I'm assuming that the light was working properly. And I'm assuming that the light is working properly. So the rule is then you stop at that light and then go when it turns green. Again, that assumption is that it's working properly is also an assumption that I have to gather evidence on. And I had evidence to prove the opposite. So, but then beyond that, you also got to consider the intent behind said rule. In this case, in a traffic stop, well, the intention is to apply structure to vehicles driving on a road for the safety of everybody driving on a road, right? So that's the assumed intent. But here's a huge blind spot we have when it comes to rules and laws. We don't know when the assumed set of conditions changes. And we don't always know the intent. And so that's what I was hit with the hardest as I was driving away. Everybody had the assumption that the light was working properly and they were sitting there following a rule in which the parameters changed. Now that makes a statement overall to where we are culturally right now. And the parallels are at least in my mind, the parallels are pretty significant, right? Because not only do we don't know when the parameters of the rule have changed, we often don't know the intent. So both of those things have to be assumed. And while we assume these things, they are often manipulated. So my question then becomes, how many of us follow or blindly follow a certain set of rules without ever really knowing that the parameters for the rules to apply have changed? And how many of us blindly follow rules without ever understanding the intent behind the rules? Worse yet, how many of us follow the rules and we assume the incorrect intent behind these rules? And that has me thinking a lot, apparently. And I wonder culturally right now where we are as a society. I wonder just how many of those rules should change. Understanding all of that stuff, that's basically why I choose to live by principle. Okay? Because with a principle as opposed to a rule, a principle, you know the conditions that are required for it to apply. There's no assumptions that you need to make with a principle. You also know the intent with a principle. There's no assumptions you have to make on that end either. So I tend to live by principle, and really think about it like a principle is derived from truth. That's why you don't have to make those assumptions. It's derived from truth, and it's the foundation basically for each belief. It's the foundation for every real like thought, true thought, and the principle could be like even just a foundation or a basis point for a line of thinking, right? You know, a lot of philosophy goes back to saying, well, we're all based on truth here. Here's the truth of the matter. Like that's what philosophy basically is. It's the seeking of the truth and building up a foundation based on that truth. So, I tend to operate in principle that way. so that nothing is assumed and so I don't mess it up. Honestly. And I kind of, I tend to, what I find funny, and it's just as a random aside, I find funny that people have come up to me before talking about like Christianity, and basically they said Christianity is, the main book of Christianity, the Bible, was just this giant rule book. Christianity is just a structure of rules that are meant to control people. And I I think it's funny because, it's kind of the exact opposite, right? Christianity is built on principles, based in principles, again, based on truth. They're derived from truth. So Christianity is more of a set of principles to operate and live by, not necessarily a rule book that can be and, often is manipulated, right? And you could, and the thing about it is you could tell when someone tries to, or when a people, or when a culture, or when throughout history, people will take Christianity and try and turn it into a bunch of rules. It has happened many a time, right? I'm not holding anybody on that one, right? But that was never the purpose of Christianity. That's never the purpose. It's just not. Christianity, again, is a set of principles, that that we ought to line ourselves up with, right? So I'm not going to dig too much more into that. I just think it was kind of funny that, most people see it as a bunch of rules, a bunch of rules to be manipulated. Another thing I find kind of funny is that, our laws within this country, we call them laws, but our rules and laws are based on, kind of loosely based on the law, which is kind of like the Ten Commandments, right? Like the Christian law, right? Which actually is a set of principles. So, that's a, say that 5 times fast. But I think that's very interesting as well, where the parts that have been taken out of the law, or rather the set of principles, the parts that have been kind of changed into a rule, often have been changed into a rule specifically for the idea of manipulation. So, and maybe I'm going too far down a rabbit hole with that one, but let me, what am I saying overall? Like, what, with this little, random portion, like what am I trying to tell you? I'm trying to tell you to examine everything. Examine what you believe. Examine what goes on around you. Examine the rules that you follow, the rules that you follow, and the rules that you unknowingly follow. Examine all of it, every single last bit of it. Don't assume the conditions. Don't assume the intent. Go actually find that stuff out. And some stuff is going to be a little bit more difficult to find, primarily because all we can go off of is evidence. But if the evidence is telling you something other than what you actually believe in, don't white knuckle it. Examine it. See what's going on. Okay? So, look, either that or I'm just trying to come up with an excuse for why I was late to work.